Faculty at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and I'm also affiliated with the Optimal Aging Center. This video is an overview of the Skills for Living with Loss personalized module from Treating Later Life Depression with Oxford University Press. As you can see, the Skills for Living with Loss is one of a series of possible modules that are available for use with clients. We wouldn't expect you to use all of the modules with any one individual. It's really meant for you to be able to pick and choose across the workbook the strategies and the areas of life challenges that are most relevant for a given individual. With that in mind, when you're working in individual psychotherapy, we'd like to encourage you to spend enough time in any given module that you really have the opportunity to develop skills and repeat information in that module, as opposed to jumping from module to module to module. So for those of you who are working in brief structured approaches, some work within primary care, EAP models, or care management, you might find learn and practice materials across a range of modules that are appropriate in use with your clients. But for those of you who are working in individual psychotherapy, we would suggest that if you're going to begin to work in the Skills for Living with Loss module, this is a commitment of at least 4 sessions, a month's worth of weekly individual at the minimum, if you're then going to really sort of be focusing on improving the ways in which they're responding to areas of loss in their life. So this orientation video is intended to provide an overview of the Skills for Living with Loss module. I'll be providing some tips and reminders about managing within session process, and I'll be directing provide further discussion of this in the clinician guide. Certainly, you're going to get the most of this overview if you have the Later Life Depression workbook and the clinician guide in front of you at the time that you're watching this video. So, as we get started, I'll just sort of point out that for clinicians, myself included, it's typically uncomfortable and awkward to get started doing a new intervention, using new intervention materials. And so I find at least that it takes me using an intervention approach with at least 2 to 3 clients before I'm beginning to feel comfortable and confident. We've done everything that we can in the second edition to provide the questions for within session discussion actually on those learn pages. And so we want to make this clinical friendly, as easy to apply as possible. So the best way for you to really get to know these materials and begin to have a sense of how they might be helpful with your clients is just roll up your sleeves and to just get started and use them. And then you'll be finding out over time which are the best fit for specific situations in your own clinical practice. So in this overview, we're going to be devoted to the points that are being made in chapter 15 of the clinician guide. So that's on pages 255 to 271, which is the chapter that's specifically focused on skills for living with loss. And as you can see, we provide a range of both learn and practice forms. We wouldn't expect you to use all of these with any one individual client. We've made some we've identified where the forms that we think that are most appropriate for use in telehealth. And I'll be walking through some examples, but overall you should would like page through and in discussions with your clients, have a sense of the aspects of their loss that are the most challenging for them, where they're struggling the most. And you'd really then want to put your attentions in those areas. And that's going to be different from person to person. In our approach for treating later life depression, we've really called upon Pam Hayes' addressing model. And here you can see that in the addressing model, age and generation intersect with a variety of other identities to shape who we all are and the things that are important to us. And in that approach, one of the nice recommendations that Pam Hayes makes is that we really want to be considering how we do our assessments, both at intake and throughout our therapy assessments, with an emphasis on cultural respect. We want to identify culture-related strengths and support early on and call on them frequently in our work, and that we're going to spend some time clarifying and keeping straight which pieces of stressors are really due to the environment, either the physical environment or social environment, where we're working with clients to help uh, adjust the best that they can to the environmental constraints that they have, and then which pieces of the problem may be internal to the client themselves. So we provide some tools for this in one of our earlier modules, in Skills for Getting Started, which is the orientation module within the workbook. You see here examples from Start 11 Learn, which is the Celebrating Diversity form that we would use within session with the client looking at this form at the same time that the clinicians looking at their own copy, and having a discussion of the identities that are most important to them that maybe have led to challenges in the past that they've overcome, and then begin that conversation to identify who the chosen family members are in their lives, the people who are most important to their day-to-day life. And we then link that to a discussion early on in therapy on values and strengths. And we provide a Start 5 practice form where, after initial conversation within session, then the clients continue to reflect on and write down their thoughts about their values and strengths that are most important to them, and how they might be able to use those specifically in therapy. And that then provides an opportunity to continue this discussion of values and strengths and to weave that throughout all of your work together. So assessment's an important thing, and that's also true when you're working in areas of bereavement. So we've provided some recommendations for assessment with bereaved clients and clients who are struggling with grief in Chapter 3 of the Clinician Guide, which is focused on assessment. That's on pages 35 to 58. And then in Appendix D, we've provided some client-ready assessment tools, including some grief-related instruments that may be useful in some situations. So in your work with clients who are struggling from a range of losses, we have some known research-supported treatment priorities. You definitely want to screen early if indicated for either prolonged grief disorder, for PTSD. We'll be talking about how important it is for you to not assume that the intervention is going to be trauma focused, that traumatic exposure is not the same thing. So traumatic exposure, traumatic loss is not the same thing as needing to do a trauma focused intervention approach. We're going to be supporting grief following a range of losses, and I'll be giving some examples of those in this overview. We want to normalize the variability that happens in grief reactions, and we're definitely facilitating a number of behaviors, self-care, developing perhaps some new routines, managing deferred projects that are feeling overwhelmed, and really looking at patterns of social withdrawal versus social connectedness, and how we can work clinically to help people stay feeling socially connected. And then we do have some information and some suggestions for working clinically in the area of cognitive reappraisal if they have specific thoughts that are upsetting, that are focused on their bereavement or on their loss experiences. So for the majority of your work with bereaved clients or clients who've experienced a range of losses, we're absolutely listening and validating their experiences. We're going to be educating about the range of normal grief responses. We're going to be having specific discussions within session on the traditions, beliefs, and preferences that they have for sharing their grief experiences. We're going to be doing a lot of support for self-care and use of natural support systems, and helping them problem solve some practical issues that can come up with a range of bereavement experiences. So here's an example of one of the forms that we provide early on that would be a conversation within session that involves the client actually looking at these materials in telehealth through screen sharing or face-to-face with them holding on to a copy of the Lost 3 Learn sheet at the same time that you've got a copy, and walking through these predominant myths that our society holds about grief, and sort of counterbalancing those with, in fact, what we know from the research. And so I'm going to walk through some of these in more detail. So, the first myth that we're addressing is the fact that that there are specific stages of grief that people go through. Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying have been a part of mainstream culture. They're actually not supported by research. We want to make sure that clinicians aren't teaching that model to clients as if it's correct. And what we are emphasizing is like, as a matter of fact, there's a lot of different reactions to loss, and that a lot of different types of patterns can be normal and healthy. And certainly people do not walk through anything that is in a staged model approach. One of the other myths that we specifically attend to is the sense of a timeline, that initially grief is intense and then it slowly declines over time. And then at some point, people have done their healthy, active grieving and they're ready to move on. And so, what we know from a fact is that some losses of individuals, of parts of our life, of a pet, of a house, of a past role are life-changing. So it makes sense that from time to time, we're going to be feeling sadness, regret, longing, and that's going to come and go in waves. And so we're really sort of disabusing folks of a very sort of timeline approach to thinking about grief reactions. And then, importantly, in the other myths, it's just emphasizing that everybody has their own individual preferences for how they grieve. And so you can see at the top of the slide, we especially want to have you follow your clients' leads and how they want to go through their grieving process. And we would like to discourage you from suggesting any specific grief practices. So in most clinical situations with normative grief reactions, you're not going to be suggesting specific rituals or journals or reviewing pictures or writing letters to the deceased. You're not making specific recommendations. You're listening to them. You're asking them what they think might be helpful, and you're following their lead as to the suggestions that they're coming up with on their own. And there's some important reasons for that. So here is a form that we just have found so helpful in our work with bereaved clients, and that's Loss for Learn, where you're talking together and having a discussion on their traditions and practices to honor loss, on the beliefs that they have about the afterlife. You're discussing the death of an individual and their preferences for expressing their grief. And just to honor the fact that there's a lot of variability. We want to, early on in our clinical work that's related to someone who's experiencing grief, we want to have this conversation so that we can really anchor and again, follow the leads of individual clients. And then early on in the Living with Loss module, we do introduce the idea of self-care and how important it is, how a loss event, whether it's the death of a person or of a pet or another sudden change in one's life, can really disrupt daily life in a variety of ways. And then we need to spend some time just attending to the parts of ourselves that help anchor us in daily life. So here's an example. Certainly somebody wouldn't have to focus on all of these, but this is an example of a form where a variety of strategies are listed, and they could circle the day of the week that they're focusing on them. If you and your client have decided that, like, of that list, there's really 3 that are most important to them, maybe you put an X through all the others and you just focus on those 3. So whatever it takes for someone to feel comfortable and to have this be practically useful in their life. So we're going to you to start with behavioral strategies rather than cognitive reappraisal. And there's some good reasons for that, both in working with depression and working with individuals seeing grief. And so here you see an example in Loss 6 Learn, where we pay attention to ways in which a variety of losses can lead to changes in daily routines and weekly patterns of life, and to have this conversation about things that might be unsettling related to the loss, but then what strategies might be helpful as they're developed, as they're returning to some routines that got disrupted at the time of a death or time of a life change, and whether they need to develop some new routines in their life. And then similarly, we also attend in this module to the fact that with especially individuals who have lost a spouse or a life partner who has been an important source of support in daily life for them, that there may just be some projects that are really overwhelming. And we give some examples from managing finances to taxes to household maintenance, that maybe that other life partner was the one who always did one thing. So we know that as clinicians, we can sort of step in and provide some extra support in problem solving. But what we want to do is we want to do this in a way that then gives those problem solving skills to the client. So as opposed to just session after session, week after week, where we're just verbally going through problem solving together, we want to specifically call upon the steps for problem solving skills and help them apply those in the specific life domain. So, there's a variety of losses that can happen. Certainly deaths of people and pets, losing other relationships. We can lose the ability to do certain things due to some illness or an injury. We may have lost a meaningful and important role or activity. So for someone who's been a very engaged family caregiver for a long time and has really lost that role through the death of an individual. And we have a number of middle-aged and older adults who've lost an important part of their physical environment, sometimes very, very suddenly. So we provide materials in the Living with Loss module to help foster conversations and skill development with some of those losses. And I'm just going to point out an example. Here is a discussion of how to talk through loss of a pet, which can certainly be similar to or the equivalent of losing a family member for many individuals. And so we're beginning to have a discussion of what it means, of what the loss means in that person's life. And then here's an example of a between sessions practice form in which individuals are both identifying the parts of the week that are most challenging and painful for them when they've missed their pet the most. And then in those challenging, difficult moments, which coping behaviors were the most helpful for them. And so what we emphasize in our clients is that these are just suggestions to hold lightly. Sometimes it helps to have a list of possibilities opposed to coming up with it on our own. So this is a checklist approach where then at the end of the week and together with you in session, you can really sort of reflect on, which strategy or set of strategies was the most helpful and supportive over the week as they were dealing with their with the pain of grieving loss of a pet. As I indicated, there's a wide range of learn forms and practice forms related to this module. We would never expect you to use all of them with any one client. They're really here as a resource for you to pick and choose. And some of the forms that we have identified as being most useful in telehealth can be used over time in a repetitive way, especially in the practice forms that can be applied over and over again. And so you can see that in the Loss 2 practice my self-care, and Loss 4 practice my routines, Loss 5 practice taking care of life tasks with deeds. So, some clinicians have asked us for recommendations for how forms fit together. So we have provided some possible session structures, but this is not intended to be a required lockstep approach. This is just some recommendations that may or may not be useful for any of your individual clients. So here you see how a review of previous treatment goals is then linked to beginning psychoeducation about grief. And as we're going through learn forms, then a good between session form would just be for them to re-look at and reread over that Loss 2 learn, Loss 3 learn, Loss 4 learn, just for them to review that material and read over it and begin to discuss. For some clients, certainly that content is intense enough and generates enough discussion that it's more than one session in order to do that. So another session, which has a focus specifically on self-care, we provide recommendations for that in the clinician guide. And again, For some clients, just the suggestion kind of like helps them reestablish themselves. And then for other clients, just this one area of self-care is then something that needs repetition week after week after week for them to really focus on. So there's a lot of variability in clients' needs related to grief. So here's a proposed session that's focused on routines and taking care of life. And again, depending upon the life circumstances of a client, this may involve several sessions of practice and repetition over time, especially with the development of new routines and the problem-solving skills related to some relatively major task that they're feeling overwhelmed by following the loss. In this session, we talk about how to think about problem solving. So continued from previous sessions, but also whether as the individual continues in therapy with you, whether they want to revise their therapy goals and include a therapy goal that's very specific to living with their grief. And we really intentionally use that phrase, living with loss, as opposed to treating grief or getting over grief, because in this world of healthy normative grief reactions, this is just a part of life that's painful, that's difficult, that individuals need some support for, but that we really just want to support healthy functioning as a part of it. So here are some of the tips that we provide in the clinician guide in pages 259 to 261, the importance of inquiring about spiritual and religious concerns, validating the difficulty in concentration and memory that many bereaved clients talk about, and then how to work with your clients on grief-related thoughts and reactions. And we'll talk about when to stay within skills for living with loss versus when to cycle back to the cognitive reappraisal module, skills for thinking, and then apply those cognitive reappraisal skills specific to grief-related or loss-related thoughts. As I indicated earlier on, we in this approach, we're talking about systematically helping clients build healthier habits on a daily basis. So this involves repetition, overlearning, and focus. So again, we do not believe that just simply having conversations is sufficient to make meaningful change in somebody's life that's going to improve quality of life. We want to focus on one or two areas of change at a time, at the very, very most, and really do that between session work of developing healthier habits. And that's going to take repetition and sustained attention and not too much jumping from topic to topic to topic. So again, to learn more about this module, I'll just refer you to chapter 15 of the clinician guide. And as we then move on to some of the other recommendations that we have for your work in applying skills for living with loss, we just remind you that the research literature on the importance of routinely tracking therapy outcomes is now so strong and so powerful in how it helps clients that it should be considered a part of your ethical care. And so with that in mind, in the Skills for Living with Loss module, we provide several forms and materials to help support that. You see here Loss One Practice, where you have an opportunity for the client to write down their existing targeted therapy goals and to identify where they see themselves at in progress on those goals currently. There's an opportunity in the Living with Loss module to develop a new therapy goal that is specific to living with loss, that's linked to how they see that their depression is linked to their grief experiences, that we're connecting this, embedding this in with that attention to values and strengths. And then we're developing some, a smart therapy goal that's really can be tracked over time. We provide towards the end of the Living with Loss module a reminder of how we think progress happens in therapy, that instead of a straight line or a stair-stepped approach, this is a really sawtooth curve with areas of progress followed by some setbacks. And so, because of that sawtooth pattern, that's one of the reasons why tracking therapy progress in a structured way in an ongoing way is so important, because a client who's been making progress and then has a setback on their own, they can feel like they're back at square one, that therapy hasn't helped at all. And just you as a therapist trying to verbally encourage them that you do see progress isn't nearly as important or impactful as then calling upon previous depression scores or previous ratings on their therapy goals and looking at those together and seeing those tangible, concrete signs of improvement. So in this section of the overview, I'm going to be providing a couple of the tips managing within session. We'd like to encourage all of you that, as discussed in the clinician guide, we want to start our sessions with a warm greeting. It's so good to see you today, Alice. I'm glad that we're here together. Let's get started by reviewing where you're at in your depression scores, and then we'll make a short list of the topics that we're going to focus on today. And that's instead of, hi, Alice, how are you? How's your week been? What should we talk about today? And then we have as a resource a preparing for session form that can help quite a bit in this area. This is intended to not be a long, effortful journaling. So 5 to 10 minutes the day before the next therapy session, the morning of the therapy session, the client has copies of this form that then they're jotting down a couple of words and phrases from what they remember in the most recent session, what they were working on between session, how that went. Did they have any difficulties? Did they learn anything new? What they want you as their therapist to know about the past week, including any major changes, and what's most important for them to talk about in today's session. Spending that time with them, organizing their thoughts written down ahead of the session goes a long way to having really good productive session time. Another part of productive session time is staying specific. So avoiding those abstract discussions that can create difficulties where it seems like you're having the same conversation week after week, session by session after session, working with specifics and details from the past week or two. Upcoming situations is going to be far more fruitful for your work. And then our emphasis on between session practice assignments is really embedded within the research literature on how change happens in therapy. So we absolutely want to be encouraging clients to practice their new skills in session. And then a way that we do that is to be very collaborative, to have lots of conversations in developing what the approach between session makes most sense for them, fits for them. So we're collaborating. We're always starting a home practice assignment in session, writing down an example from that day, from the previous day. We're setting a date and a time to complete and writing it down. We're problem solving potential barriers, and we provide a variety of tips for this. But the bottom line is that between session, a client looking at any given practice form shouldn't feel like they're starting from scratch. They should already have something circled, written down, an example already to feel like they're just continuing the work of the between session practice as opposed to grinding up and starting from scratch. And so a part of doing this is making sure that they're ending their session with a brief written session summary form. So towards the end of your session time, you're allowing enough time for, again, just a couple words or phrases. And this can be done in telehealth through either their screen sharing, if they're using a laptop or desktop where they have writing capabilities and they just want to open up a Word file. If this is on telephone only, where they have a blank sheet of paper next to them and you're talking them through just a couple words and phrases. What are the most important things we focused on today? What does the client want to remember? Gives you a chance as a therapist to suggest a couple of things that you hope they remember, what they're going to be working on within session, and then who might be able to help support them as they're doing that work. So all of this takes some effort and some time, right? We have session pacing as an important thing to leave time at the end of the session to write down that summary of the key points, to clarify questions about home practice, to do that end of session feedback where you're asking for feedback from the client. We're getting to the end of our time today. As you think about how we spent our session, was there anything that I said that didn't sit well with you, that felt off? It provides an opportunity to discuss that. And then you also can provide some feedback about the things that you found the most helpful in the session, the ways in which you're seeing progress, the pieces of their life, the work that they're doing that you find to be very encouraging in an authentic way. And so we provide at the end of the Skills for Living with Loss module, the final practice form is an opportunity for review. So if you're then deciding that you're beginning to shift away from a focus on grief into other areas of their life or other skills, or as you're then nearing towards therapy termination, you're then having an opportunity for them to write down and sort of identify the specific practice forms or the specific learn forms that were most impactful for them, that they'd really like to remember to return to over time, anticipating future situations related to their losses that may be particularly painful, particularly challenging, and then what the skill and what practice form is going to be most helpful for them in that situation. And again, this isn't just talking about, but writing it down so that they can return to this in their therapy folder in future times where they're struggling. We provide a variety of tip sheets at the Optimal Aging Center's website, and you see them depicted here. We have a tip sheet on general strategies for work with middle-aged and older adults, on attending to physical and medical issues, and then our tips for managing within session. At the Optimal Aging Center is a discussion of opportunities that are available for you to receive consultation and the additional videos, webinars that are provided through the E4 Center. With that, we finished our overview on skills with living with loss, and I hope that this has been helpful.